Welcome back. Oh, the technology works. You can hear me. That's good news. Great start. This is the fourth Inside St. Bride that we've done in the last 3 years or so. St. Bride has an international reputation for the quality of some of the holdings we have here. It's a tremendous collection, a huge number of original drawings by Eric Gill, things like the Kelmscott Chaucer, but they are not what Inside St. Bride is really about. Inside St. Bride is about the quirky, the unusual, sometimes the uncatalogued items that we have here in the library. I've spent 10 years rummaging through cupboards, going through shelves in an attempt to find my way around this place. And some of the things that have turned up over that decade or so have been written down in a series of little books like this. The first one was blue. That was filled up very quickly. The second one was a black book. I'm on the third black book now. And these are just notes of all sorts of things. Chromo collar types by W. Griggs, box C502. It doesn't say any more than that, but that tells me that it's something really worth going back and looking at in a bit more detail. I'm happy to continue filling these books, and I think as long as I'll be here, there'll always be new material to add to them. And we are still adding to the collections. St. Bride is not a static collection. It continues to grow, and sometimes the material that we acquire comes from the most peculiar and unusual places. And if Becky will change on, this is where our latest acquisition came from. And this was not only a surprise, it was an absolute shock. On Valentine's Day this year, 14th of February, I had an email from a friend of mine, Alan Brignall, who runs the Hedgehog Press in Wivenhoe. And he just sent me a link, and it simply said, have a look at this. So I clicked on it, and it took me through to an eBay sale. And the item on the sale was described as letterpress set. And it was nothing of the kind. If you can move on to the next image, Becky, it was a box, a plain mahogany box. Now, that immediately caught my attention because here we have the surviving punches from the Caslon Type Foundry, set up some 300 years ago or so, and they all happen to be stored in boxes very much like this one. We have 1,501 of these upstairs in the main book stack. And if you go change on again, Becky, the only indication as to what might be in the box was the number 83. Now, all of our Caslon boxes have a number. They date back to when Caslon had their own internal inventory of the material that they held. And if you change on one more time, this is an image from eBay, and it shows punches and mats for a typeface. Not a very substantial typeface. There are only 12 punches and 12 mats. Some of the close-up images, I'm not sure if we have one on the next slide. Yes. Some of the close-up images showed the characters to be distorted. The G in particular, bottom right, you can see is very squashed. And I couldn't make any sense of these. Why were there only 12 of them? If you change on again, Becky, 12 punches, sorry, the other direction. That's the, yeah, you were right there. The G, as you can see there in print, doesn't look very good at all. In fact, when it is printed, the hairlines almost disappear. It's a pretty ugly looking character on the printed page. So of course I contacted the real font of all knowledge, James Mosley. I sent the eBay link to James and said, have you ever seen anything like this? And about half an hour later, back came a 4-page explanation as to what I was looking at. And James is, or was, shocked as much as I was, because these punches were made in 1802. And they were designed by a man called Philip Rusher for a special edition of Rasselas by Dr. Johnston. Now, Rusher was a bank clerk. In fact, I've done a little bit more digging into his background. He's identified on the patent for this particular typeface because he did register it, number 2620, registered patent for Rusher's typeface. And he used it in an edition of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, written by Dr. Johnson many years before. Why he chose that is a bit of a puzzle. And it's rather an unfortunate choice as well, because most of the action in Rasselas takes place in Egypt. And 3 of the characters which Philip Rusher redesigned were the G, the Y, and the P. So the word Egypt appears again and again throughout the book. What have we got next? As you can see there, it doesn't look very attractive, but when it's repeated endlessly, you begin to see why his gifts weren't in the direction of typeface design. Why did he do it? Well, he didn't like the way that books actually looked. He thought the lines were far too far apart. They were very wasteful of paper. And by removing all descenders and by pruning the ascenders by at least a third, he created a typeface which was, I think he calls it, a method of beautification of the English language, or words to that effect. It's pretty hideous. It's not got any redeeming features at all. But he paid for that edition of Rasselas to be published at his own cost. It was printed by a printer in Banbury, Cheney. And Cheney were in fact still trading in 2005. They had a long and illustrious history. This particular edition isn't part of that. Suffice to say that his new improved types didn't go down terribly well. Philip Rusher, this was Charles Timperley in his Dictionary of Printers and Printing in 1839, said Philip Rusher obtained a patent for various improvements and alterations to the forms of printing types. From a copy of Mr. Rusher's Rasselas, printed with Mr. Rusher's improved types in italics, we consider them to be anything but what the preamble of his patent would have us believe. What's the next one we've got, Becky? This is an example. It's an introduction to the edition. On the left-hand side, you can see conventional typesetting. I think he's exaggerated the line spacing for his effect. And on the right-hand side, there is Rusher's patent types, improved types. And the whole book is set rather like the right-hand example. It does nothing to improve types at all. And the printing historian Alistair Johnson actually says, the book is an unremittingly dull story with little incident and a dim grasp of locale, in addition to being a pretty ugly presentation. He also says it has the great misfortune of being set largely in Egypt, which I mentioned, a word which features 3 consecutive examples of Russia's dismal letter forms. Talbot Baines Reed, oh, you can see more examples there. He couldn't quite find a substitute for the lowercase p. So all he did was use a small capital. Wherever the lowercase p appeared, small capital, as you can see in the middle of the word stepped. When a word began with a G, he used a small capital G. So there's a lack of consistency even in the way he applied his own new design. And in the introduction, he points out that the types have been further developed as this book was being printed. So the letter Y that you see at the beginning of the book is not actually the same version that you see by you reach the end of the book. Not a great deal to redeem it. Talbot Baines Reed, the author of A History of the Old English Letter Foundries, was a little more generous. He described Philip Rusher as a misguided reformer, but says that it didn't take long for printers to return to the types of Caslon, Baskerville, and others. In fact, the book only used the 12 new characters that were designed specifically by Rusher. The rest of the face was Caslon's English #1 in pica size. How did the punches end up on eBay? Well, that's a bit of a puzzle. Fred Gowdy, in his Typologia in 1940, mentions that the punches were last recorded in a 19th century inventory of the Caslon foundry, but he can't provide a source for that information. Gowdy says, in 1894, a package marked in indistinct characters, Russia's type, was found to contain the punches for the patent type of the Rasselas, consisting of the letters B, D, F, H, K, L, 2 F ligatures, J, P, and Y, to be used with Caslon's English #1 on pica body. So, how did they end up on eBay? Well, they were at Caslon in 1894, that much we know. The printer Cheney ceased trading in 2005, and the assets, or at least part of the assets, were bought by a man called Paul Lester. And the Rasselas punches, which are here, were in his keeping until he decided to reduce the size of his collection. He collects all sorts of printing bric-a-brac, and he put them onto eBay without really understanding, I think, quite what he had in his hands. I got them for £51.74, which is quite a bargain, because I think many American universities would have paid at least 10 times that amount to get their hands on them. Because they came from the Caslon foundry, they're going back into the collection here at St. Bride, so they'll join their 1,501 colleagues upstairs. If you move on, Becky, what else do we have? This is part of the patent number 2620, because he really went overboard with his designs. Not content with just redesigning those dozen characters, he created italic versions, outline versions as well. And I've ringed some of these curious little bow ties, which he's attached to the characters at the bottom. The P, the Y, the T. Why this additional bit of decoration was added, I'm not really sure. And it's puzzling as to why the patent was actually granted. It's a curious thing to apply for and to get through. Certainly in the 20th century, when Stevenson Blake were trying to register some of their designs, they did it through the design registration process, which didn't really, in the end, give them any protection at all. If you move on to the next one, Becky. This is Talbot Baines Reed's review, which I've already mentioned. So move on. Charles Timperley, who was rather more insulting when he said, "We consider them anything but what the preamble would have us believe." And one more, I think. The British and Colonial Printer and Stationer. This was the centenary of the registration of the patent. They were looking back at typographic innovations of the previous century, and they mentioned Bracellus and the Russia types. They were no less complimentary than any of the others at the time when they first appeared. What's interesting about the printer and British and Colonial Printer, rather, the only copy of Rasellus that the author of this article was able to find anywhere, and he'd been a book dealer for many years, was here at St. Bride. So in fact, it is this copy, the St. Bride Bracellus, which the British and Colonial Printer refers to in that review. Yes, I can, of course, yeah. Indeed, I think that this is William Blade's copy, by the way, and that's the page you've already seen. Let's find a page of text. In fact, when you get into the body of the book, he doesn't set it as tight as it was set on the first page. Now, what's the next image that we have? Oh, yes, an advertisement at the back of the book for the next production using Russia's patent types, The Deserted Village by James Goldsmith, not James Goldsmith, Dr. Goldsmith. And in fact, I don't think it ever appeared. I think the British public, the reading public, had quite enough of Rasellus and Russia's types. But he did say, if we move on, if you would like to have your book published using the types of the Rasellus, please get in touch with Mr. Philip Russia, and he will make arrangements for that to be done. Which brings us on to the next item on the table. And this is a bit of a mystery that some of you may be able to help us with. I had a chat with Steve and Mick before the talk tonight to see if they could give us any further clues as to the origins of this. What I have in front of me is a case of type. But in fact, before the case of type, I found a case lay in a pile of documents some time ago. And I put it to one side because we never throw anything away in St. Bride. It might turn out to be valuable. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, when we were clearing the back bar, an area in the basement, we found some cases of type, mainly non-Latin faces, Japanese, Tibetan, all sorts of interesting foreign languages. But amongst them was this case. And when we looked at the type, we couldn't identify it. We really just didn't know what it was. Case lay here was from Stephen Austin in Hartford, who specialized in non-Latin typesetting. They did foreign language typesetting predominantly. So we assumed it might be a foreign language. None of the characters looked familiar. What's the next one? Oh, yes. And then we discovered it's Shavio Phonetica. It's a synthetic language developed by George Bernard Shaw in his obsession with spelling reform, which dates back to the 1920s. He'd spent his life frustrated by the lack of any logic in the English language, and he wanted to make it a much more simple language to speak. Top line is Shavio Phonetica for St. Bride. It actually seems to have more characters. One of Shaw's aims was to reduce the number of characters you required. And in fact, in 1946, he wrote to the Times, just after the Second World War, following the bombing of Hiroshima. And there was a very long letter which they published, in which he said the word bomb, which has appeared so often in the press recently as a result of the war, doesn't need the final B. It still says bomb if you just use the first three letters. So you are wasting 25% of your effort adding an ornamental character which does nothing. And that was the basis of Shavio Phonetica, to try and reduce the language. In fact, he increased the alphabet in a sense because he needed about 40 sounds to be able to build up the words. If you move on, this is one of the great failings of Shavio Phonetica because it's essentially based on received pronunciation. You spell a word differently depending on where you live in the country. Shaw was aware of this and he did actually make reference to it, but if you live in the southeast, you'll have a bath. If you live in the north, you'll have a bath. And Shavio Phonetica has different characters depending on the pronunciation. So there is a lack of consistency there. What's the next one? Oh yes, the famous example, which some of you will have seen, many of you should be familiar with it. Goatee is fish, the same word. Because the F of fish in the top word, GH, if you have those two letters at the end of the word tough, the GH is an F sound. If you go onto Google, I will let Google explain what the other components add up to, but goatee is George Bernard Shaw's way of illustrating how nonsensical the English language can be. And what's next, Becky? When he was creating this new language, Shavio Phonetica, Shaw script, Shavian script, he worked with his printer, a man called Harold White, Harold O. White of the Legross Press. Now, Harold White was a very fine printer, a good friend to Shaw, and in fact, Harold White was the witness to George Bernard Shaw's will, him and his wife. Shaw sent this to Harold White and said, I want this turned into my new language. But of course, he did this at a point before the new language had been designed. This was in the late 40s, early 1950s. So Harold White had to convert Shaw's handwritten text into a page of text using characters which don't normally appear in the English language to represent sounds. And between Harold and Shaw, they devised a table of sounds. They worked out that about 40 different sounds make up the alphabet. And this, in fact, if I put it down here, you may be able to see it. They decided, for instance, that the Cyrillic letter R would represent a th sound. And they built up pages of text using characters which were available from any type founder. And the next example will show you what came out of that. This is a passage which actually says, and I'll pick this up to read it. This is Shavio Phonetica in a sort of embryo form. It says, Chang at leisure was superior to Lynch in his rouge, munching a lozenge at the burial in Merrion Square. It is nonsense, but the whole point of it was to show how little space Shavio Phonetica would require on the printed page. Shaw was obsessed with this development. He felt that our language could be stripped of about 25% of its content and still sound and read the same. And when he died in 1950, he left substantial sums of money to the further development of Shavio Phonetica. In fact, the will was challenged almost immediately. And after the public trustee had essentially revised the will, very little was left, only enough money, in fact, to produce an edition of Androcles and the Lion, 2 editions. The public trustee produced a library edition, which is on a much better quality paper. And then there was a Penguin edition, which was on a much cheaper newsprint. I'll put them both down there, even though they're on the screen behind me. The public trustee edition was given to libraries, colleges, universities. Places like St. Bride received a copy. The Penguin edition you had to pay 3 and 6pence for. And that's what it looked like on the printed page. On the right-hand side in conventional English, on the left-hand side in Shavian script. It takes about a third less space. Again, Shaw was all about saving paper, saving work, giving people more free time for leisure. In reality, I'm not sure that people would want the extra leisure time if they didn't get paid for it. I've put a red box around the word Androcles because for proper nouns, they are indicated with a center dot. That appears before the word. So Androcles and his wife, Megara, they both have that dot before them. Punctuation stays the same, as do numbers. There was no substitute for numbers. And the puzzling thing about this is, on the right-hand side here, you can see that Androcles was any age from 30 to 55. But Shaw decides to spell it out in Shavio Phonetica when he could have just used numbers and saved himself half a dozen characters. So again, there's a bit of inconsistency there. If you move on, Becky. It's not dead. Shavio Phonetica, starved of funds in the 1960s, should have faded away, but it's seen a revival in recent years. This is a recent edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is in Shavian script. We have a copy in the library. When I found out it had been published, I just decided St. Bride had to have a copy. As we have Androcles the Lion, why not? And this is something that's always been of interest to me. We have a collection of shorthand books upstairs, and there is a shorthand edition of Alice in Wonderland, and I wondered how they did the Tale of the Mouse. They did it in shorthand exactly the same way, and here in the Shavian edition, they followed the pattern using the same characters, just in reducing size. Thanks, Becky. Before we move on from Shavio Phonetica, it's set in monotype. Now, I'm a volunteer at the Type Archive. I'm there 1 or 2 days every week. This is undoubtedly monotype. The nick on the type is square. Monotype have no record of this typeface whatsoever. It doesn't have a series number. There are no patterns. There are no punches. There are no mats. There's no documentation. There are no specimen sheets. In the archives at the Type Archive, there are no proofs. There's no evidence that this typeface ever existed as monotype. Duncan Avery, who's been with monotype since the beginning of the Second World War, has been through the vault, and we have turned over every cupboard and every shelf, and it's a puzzle. The curious thing is that in January 1963, in print in Britain, there was an article published by Arthur Phillips about Shavio Phonetica. And he shows, I don't think we have a slide of this, so I'll put it here. There are 3 different variations. There's a bold, an italic, and a Roman of that. Can we see the 3? And we think, I certainly knew we had 2 cases. Mick told me this evening, the 3rd case seems to have turned up. The italic has been found. So all 3 cases are here. It's monotype, but it's not monotype. So where did it come from? Did Stephen Austin cast their own? Well, that's possible, but did they really make patterns? Did they produce punches? Did they strike mats? It was quite an undertaking for a printer of any size without involving the Monotype Corporation. So the origin of this type remains a mystery. And if anyone can throw any light upon where Shavio Phonetica in the form of 13-point monotype actually came from, we'd love to hear from you so we can add to the documentation that we have and clear up a few puzzles. Okay, what do we have next? Oh yes, a bit of fun. I was astounded when I came here 10 years ago to find dotted around the library John Bull printing outfits, half a dozen of them, and I think we found 2 more since then. John Bull printing outfits in their really iconic livery. The box hasn't changed in I don't know how many years. It's been around certainly since 1927. The company celebrates its centenary next year. And they still exist, although it's a very convoluted history. There are lots of anniversaries next year, which we'll come to. The John Bull printing set, as far as I can tell, was available in 1910. I found a stationer's receipt for a stationer's in Wandsworth for a John Bull printing set. It clearly says John Bull printing set, 2 and 6pence. The company that made these, the Charter Stamp Company, was founded in March 1922. So it's their centenary next year. But this chap, John Bull as he appears on the box, that design wasn't registered until 1927, although the trademark had been in use for, well, 17 years at that stage. If we can go back to the previous one, Becky, this is a Charter series box of rubber stamps, a children's zoo set that dates from about 1910. It shows a group of children riding on an elephant, presumably in London Zoo. In fact, absolutely in London Zoo, because I bought a postcard on eBay of that exact view. I mean, the artist has embellished it very slightly, but even the keeper, the children on the back, everything about it. It's a photo, a colored photographic postcard, which matches the box. And this is Edwardian. This is probably about 1910, I would guess. If we can move on a couple, Becky. 1946, everyone thinks of John Bull printing sets as being rubber. 1946, they started producing, pardon me, a monotype edition using 12-point monotype Gill sands in metal. It didn't last very long. We can date it pretty much precisely because there's a registered design and a patent for the typecase that you see in the background there, which is dated mid-1946. Unfortunately, this was made for children. So the pieces are quite small and quite sharp. And they issued this set with the standard water-based ink. Now, if you try and take a print using metal type on a water-based ink pad, you're not going to get very good results. So by the end of the decade, that had gone. By 1950, the John Bull printing set in metal was no more. Next one, Becky. This really is to show how powerful this trademark had become by 2008. The box with John Bull and his bulldog, and they made many hundreds of different sets, some with pictures and some without. In 2009, after the worldwide financial crash, The Guardian published this cartoon, a John Bull quantitative easing kit, which shows John Bull with his bulldog toes turned up. And I think the fact that The Guardian was able to use that image gives some indication as to how powerful that box design actually is. So many children, male and female. My first interest in printing was really through a John Bull printing set. Thanks, Becky. Another interest as a child, which another book which sparked my interest in printing was this one by Harold Kirwan. It's just called Printing. There were several editions. How are we doing there? The cover changed several times. Mine is a slightly later edition than that one. So, of course, again, when I came to St. Bride, 3 books really inspired me as a child and a teenager. One was Printing by Harold Kirwan. Another one was Printing as a Hobby by, I think we might have an image of that. Oh, no, sorry, go back, go back. Printing as a Hobby by an American called J. Ben Lieberman. And the third book was Printing for Pleasure by John Ryder, all of which are here at St. Bride, including books for children on how to print. I was delighted to find when I came here that the John Ryder book in particular, Printing for Pleasure, that mentions a miniature portfolio of private presses. And I'd never seen it. He reproduces 2 images from that portfolio of about 40 presses. The complete portfolio is here at St. Bride. The Harold Kirwan book here. All of the flongs used in the production of that book are here at St. Bride. What's a flong, I hear some of you asking. If you're printing books in very large quantities, you set the page of type with an illustration, but you want to run this on several different machines simultaneously to produce a high volume of books. With a flong, you apply a sheet of plasticized papier-mâché, plaster of Paris used to be used. That is applied under heat and pressure to the form, and it bakes to produce a mold. And this mold can then be used to produce numerous printing plates, all identical. So you can run several pages on different machines simultaneously. And all of the flongs for that book by Harold Kirwan were sitting upstairs in room 19. J. Ben Lieberman, the man I mentioned who wrote Printing as a Hobby, in fact, he mentions another publication called the International Czech Log of Private Press Names. And if you were anybody in the 60s and you had a private press, even if it was just on the kitchen table, you could register the name of your press with Ben Lieberman, and this log would be circulated worldwide. It was printed in an edition of about 1,500 copies. They're all here. All the editions are here at St. Bride. So all these childhood books which inspired me and the things they talked about are here at St. Bride. Moving on. Anyone live in Sudbury Town? Anyone live near Sudbury Town? Yes. Well, you'll know what this is. This is a bullseye, a roundel from Sudbury Town Tube Station. But it's unlike any other tube station sign on the whole network. 280 odd stations use a typeface called the Johnston Railway alphabet. Sudbury Town doesn't, because in the 1930s, when the Piccadilly line was under construction, Frank Pick, the design guru in charge of how London transport looked, decided that perhaps after 20 years of Edward Johnston's sans serif, they needed to refresh the look of the network. And so he commissioned a man called Percy Delph Smith to come up with a new look for the Piccadilly line. And Delph Smith created a petty serif, and that's it. You can see the close-up there. If you travel through that station on the Piccadilly line and you don't get off, you think it's Johnston Sands. If you do get off and you have a look, you'll find that not only the station bullseye, but the way out sign, the next one, ladies and gentlemen's toilets, all the signage on that station is in petty serif, the Percy Delph Smith typeface. Why they preserved it, I'm not quite sure. It was applied to other stations on the network, and then at a later stage, the decision was reversed and it was reinstated as the Johnston typeface. But Sudbury Town survives, and I believe that when signs do have to be replaced, they use the Percy Delph Smith's petty serif. This is from a 1916 book called The Ship Painter's Handbook, edited by a Mr. Eric Gill, who I can tell you didn't get on very well with Percy Delph Smith, didn't like Eric Gill at all. How do I know that? Well, Percy's great nephew, Peter Delph, came in to do some research here at the library, and we had a conversation about Eric Gill and Percy, because they were doing very much the same sort of work. Percy Delph Smith was a fine artist. He wasn't just a lettering artist, a calligrapher, a graphic designer, a typeface designer. He was a very fine painter too. And Keith Adams, who's here tonight, I know has been able to acquire part of Percy's collection, which includes some wonderful portraits of his wife and other family members. Perhaps this is part of the reason why Gill and Percy Delph Smith didn't get on very well. This is Eric Gill's alphabet, a recommended typeface, calligraphic style for painting the names on the fronts of ships. It's almost identical to Percy's petty serif used 20 years later, 30 years later, no, 20 years later on the Piccadilly line. So perhaps there's a reason for some of the enmity, at least, although I believe that Percy Delph Smith didn't approve of Eric Gill's private life, so that had a contributing factor. What's the next one, Becky? Oh yes, why am I mentioning Percy Delph Smith in connection with St. Bride? Because his drawings for Sudbury Town are here in the library. We have 12 boxes upstairs of Percy Dull Smith archives. When Percy died, his widow, Marion, decided to split his archive into multiple packages and to distribute them around the country so that wherever you were, if you wanted to do some research into her late husband, there would always be a university or a library somewhere nearby that had at least some of his stuff. 12 boxes of it came here to St. Bride. They're sitting upstairs, and they include Percy Dull Smith's address book, which is a mixture of personal and private addresses. And in fact, if I put it down here, is there one? You'd be astounded at the addresses that are in here. Can we see Eric Gill on there? Mr. Eric Gill, who was then living at Piggott's in High Wycombe, telephone Knapp Hill 42. That was Eric's number. Just skimming through the address book, Ambrose Heel, Douglas Cockerell, Mary Stopes. Mary Stopes? Richard B. Fishenden, R.B. Fishenden, Robert Gibbings, the wood engraver, Eric Gill, Robert Harling, Barnett Friedman, Grayley Hewitt, John Betjeman, who was described as a journalist, and the Queen. Not that one. This is Waterloo 4900, and the Queen was a magazine of some kind. But the great and the good are all represented. It's an incredible collection. We've started conserving it because a lot of it is not in great condition. But that had to stop at the beginning of lockdown. 2 boxes have been completed out of 12. So there's still some way to go before we can actually say that the collection is in good shape. This is one of the things from box 8. So it's quite a way down the line before we get to that one. What's next? Oh, a pause and move on. Oh yeah, printing. If you cut through that one, thanks. Printing is a hobby, and they were the flongs. Yeah. Oh yes, right. The next item is another new acquisition. This book here, Typographical Printing Surfaces by Legross and Grant. It is the Bible for type founders. Everything you could possibly want to know about the creation of a typeface from scratch, right through to the final casting. Whatever machine, whether it's using a hand mold or a monotype machine, whether it's a linotype or an intertype, there are technical standards, tables. It's a tremendous work. It was published in 1916, but most of the edition was pulped. So it's a very expensive book if you try to buy a first edition these days. But every chapter in that book, or the majority of the chapters, is prefixed with a quotation from a book called The Mirror of Printing. And they are wonderful quotations. My favorite is the one at the bottom here. He that readeth a face at sight hath the gift of kings. If you can recognize and identify a typeface just by looking at it, you have the gift of kings. And it goes on to say, verily for him that is of the craft, it is a dower royal, so to tell face from face. So it gets better. He's heaping praise on people who can identify typefaces. And more importantly, people who have the good judgment to know what constitutes a good typeface or a Philip Rusher Rasselas typeface. He says, for some typefaces be right rogues and will offend in any form. Now, about 10 years ago, when I'd been working here as a volunteer for a few months, when Holly Trant was here, we had someone who came into the reading room and wanted to see a copy of The Mirror of Printing. And I searched the catalogue, which incidentally at the time was shared with the Corporation of London. So we could also see everything that was held in Corporation of London libraries. And there was no copy of The Mirror of Printing. And this chap had been to the British Library and they couldn't produce a copy either. No sign of it. So that was a bit of a puzzle. Thought no more about it. He went away disappointed, but then 4 or 5 years later, a woman came in and made the same request. Do you have a copy of The Mirror of Printing? Why? Well, I've seen some quotes in a book and I wanted to see the original book. By then I'd been told, possibly by James Mosley, The mirror of printing doesn't exist. It never did. It was a totally fictitious invention. Lucien Legross, because he wanted to dress up his chapter headings, fabricated every single one of them. They are pure invention, but they are exquisitely crafted pieces of pure invention. And he also took the opportunity with all of his chapter headings to showcase some of the types that were then available. So each of these is set in sometimes a sort of fake medieval black letter, or occasionally in a standard Roman face. I think that's Divini. Why am I mentioning this? Well, the mirror of printing now exists. We have a copy. And because there are only a few quotations, Peter Criddle of the Auricius Press last year decided to put them all into one volume. And he's produced the book which doesn't exist, the book which no library can produce for you. St. Bride now can. It's a thin paperback, it's about 24 pages, but all of those quotes are now embodied in a single volume. And the next time somebody comes in and says, do you have a copy? I'm delighted to be able to say, yes, we have. And thank you to Peter for that. And that pretty much wraps it up, with one exception. In the last edition of Ultra Bold, you will have seen this print, which Simon included. This is by John Griffiths. Can you see it? You can see it now, yeah, you can't see me. This is the Kirwan print shop in Plaistow in 1955. I don't have an image to put on the screen, unfortunately. John Griffiths was commissioned by Beatrice Ward, who was the publicity manager for the Monotype Corporation, to produce an image that they could give away to their customers, or sell to some customers in some cases. And John Griffiths cut this from a single piece of lino. And it was printed at Kirwan on the largest press they had. I'll have to look at the piece of paper on the front because I can't remember what it was. That's a plastic paperclip, by the way. There's a note attached to the St. Bride copy which says, Herbert Simon says that these were done for Beatrice Ward on the double crown hand-fed mealer from one piece of lino. And exquisite it is too. John Griffiths was an illustrator who worked for Penguin, amongst other companies. He also lectured, I think, at the Royal College of Art. But it's a superb piece of work. And in fact, what you didn't see in Ultra Bold was the fact that it is one of two. The other one is a medieval printing office, which we have underneath. I'll give you an opportunity to look at that one in a bit of detail. The wonderful thing about this is the observation of the fine detail of the Kirwan press. There's so many tiny details that only a printer would recognize. There's a line height gauge, which is just down here. Solvent dispensers, there's somebody having sandwiches. There's a hell box, which is a box for scrap monotype, which is going to be melted down and turned into new type. And some very interesting characters there. There are two pigeons peeping in through the skylight at the top. I would love to have this reprinted. And in fact, when Beatrice Ward commissioned this, it was partly to raise money for St. Bride Printing Library. And it does say on the back, yes, it says on the back, one of a pair of posters designed and cut on linoleum by John C. Griffiths, ARCA, printed directly from the original blocks at the Kirwan Press, each in a strictly limited edition. It doesn't say how large the edition is. A number of copies of each have been reserved for sale at 10 shillings a pair for the benefit of St. Bride Printing Library. So I don't think Beatrice Ward or John Griffiths would object if we did a reprint. The companion piece is this one, a 16th century printing office. We have two of each of these upstairs. That is the other one. This was produced in 1954, also by John Griffiths, who's sadly no longer with us. He died some years ago now. And again, they would make a rather nice companion pair. And I think that pretty much, although we're slightly under, that pretty much brings me to the end of the material that I've brought down.